So I did a video on this topic about 6 years ago, but I think it's worth expanding on because even though most people are aware that there's some media bias, I don't think many of us remain fully conscious of just how this media message influences our entire worldview. There are more press agents today than there are actual members of the press, which means that when you're watching the news, it's not just the commercials in between, it's the entire news show, which is a managed message. Press agents cost a lot of money, and so there are economic interests behind nearly everything you see in the mass media because it takes money to get that message there. People think that they're watching The Daily Show, and so it's an unbiased news source. No, everyone, even on The Daily Show, had a press agent to get them there. People think that they're watching a movie even, and that they're just seeing entertainment. There are many movie themes which are supported in part by industrial interests, which I'll get into later in the video. A good book on this topic is The Father of Spin by Larry Tye. It's about Edward Bernays, one of the founders of the modern ad campaign. It's a very well-researched scholarly book that gives a lot of the history on how modern ad campaigns developed. A little more extreme book is called The Toxic Sludge is Good for You, which gives pretty extreme examples of how absurd things have been put into the public consciousness by press agents. And there's also a good documentary online called Psywar, which goes over how public consciousness is melded. I'll put links to those in the description box. It's really useful to read these books because it gives you a much better idea of how pervasive the molding of public consciousness is. Everyone falls subject to this in some way. If you're receiving information passively from the news or from newspapers, remember, everything that you're reading has been paid for. You don't get messages out into the modern media without a good press agent, which is very expensive. And it's almost impossible for an individual to remain aware of where all these messages are coming from and to catch them all and stop them from seeping into your subconscious. The typical way that this has been done for 100 years or so is that so-called scientists are hired by a special interest group promoted by industry, and then they put out a study which is picked up by a press agent and then spread throughout the press, and people think that the scientific community supports this or that belief, particularly about food and health, without recognizing that it's nothing more than a paid ad campaign for some industrial group. A terrible example of this was hydrogenated oil and how people were brainwashed for a decade or so into believing that that was a healthy product. But sometimes it's much more subtle than that. You see a lot of news stories nowadays about a broad range of semi-natural foods being unhealthy. You'll rarely see a story that says McDonald's or Coca-Cola are unhealthy, but by muddying the water, these junk food purveyors are able to make people think that, well, everything is unhealthy, and so it's not so bad to eat junk food. You'll also never see a news story that just says, eat natural food, that's the healthiest thing to do, because again, there's no money behind that message. I could give examples all night of various ad campaigns. One thing you see a lot in the news recently is the Keystone Pipeline. Most people don't recognize that there's a monopoly over oil, the oil pipeline system going into Oklahoma, and so all of the oil from the tar sands and from the Midwest has to be sold at about 20% below world market rates. There are billions of dollars at stake, and the Keystone Pipeline would break that monopoly, and that's why you hear so much about it. Another monopoly that's always been very effective at using the media is the De Beers diamond monopoly. They're a little better documented than other monopolies because they're not under the control of the United States corporations. They've been able to basically brainwash the entire world population into believing that diamond is the most valuable gemstone, and they've been very effective at controlling and shutting down any competing sources of diamond. Or the whole concept of conflict diamonds is something invented by the De Beers monopoly in order to shut down independent diamond miners in Africa, and it's been extended to other things, to other conflict minerals. Anything that's generally called a conflict commodity is basically just something that's not under the control of Western monopolies. And you'll notice particularly with De Beers diamond monopoly that the message will even come through the movie industry. A lot of the movie industry has traditionally portrayed diamonds as the most glamorous gemstone, also very focused on conflict diamonds in many movie themes. These messages come through in so many different ways, so subtly, that people are not at all aware that their worldview is being formed. Even someone like Noam Chomsky, for example, who wrote the book Manufacturing Consent about this very topic, falls into the global warming debate. You'll notice that there are very rarely, if ever, hard-hitting news stories about peak oil, that the establishment's answer to peak oil is to talk about global warming, which really addresses the issues but doesn't cause people to panic. And people tend to rebel against hearing this kind of thing because nobody likes to think that your entire worldview is shaped to such a large degree by outside entities. But it's just natural that if you're a passive recipient of information, as almost everyone is in large part, that Of course other people are going to form your worldview. It's only when you actively seek knowledge that you can overcome this problem. When you try to find information from many different sources and critically analyze it, but that has to be a conscious decision on your part. Another thing people tend not to recognize, or at least stay aware of, is just how managed and focused the message is that you're getting from the mainstream media. It's hard, if not impossible, to prove, but you can kind of observe what's happening just by looking at how certain topics are completely blacked out, and anyone who ever broaches those subjects is never allowed back in the mainstream media. These topics include the banking industry. You'll never hear any real critical evaluation of the banking industry. You'll hear constant debate over what level personal income tax rates should be, but you'll never hear debate over what level corporate income tax rates should be, or at least not a meaningful debate that's ever pushed to any large degree. You'll never see a real story on peak oil, almost never. You'll hear endless information about global warming. And regardless of which so-called independent news outlet someone appears on, if they broach the wrong topics, they're never going to come back. Cindy Sheehan, for example, is all over every news outlet until she started to favor the goals of the freedom movement, and then she was completely removed from all the news outlets. If you care to watch the mainstream news for a number of years, you'll notice a high degree of coordination between these supposedly independent news outlets and a real focus to the messages, which shows a much smaller group of controllers than you would normally expect or than almost anyone suspects. You see one example of this recently with the Tea Party movement and the Occupy movement. Both started out with original goals that were very similar, fighting the establishment's control over politics, particularly the banking industry's control over politics. But when the media owned by the establishment tries to portray each group, one is controlled by right-wing extremists, the other is controlled by left-wing extremists. When the majority of the population is receiving this information passively, they just buy into it and get drawn into the conflict, and the whole movement can be diffused pretty easily. The establishment also always portrays false leaders to make a movement look foolish. Sarah Palin always being pushed as the leader of the freedom movement, for example. There are a lot of different tactics that are used, and it's almost impossible not to fall into these tactics when you're passively receiving information constantly. Even more dangerous than being lied to on individual issues, though, is the way in which the media and the establishment shape the entire public consciousness around broad areas of belief. For example, the belief that change is effected through politics. You'll constantly see the media and the establishment focus on politics, especially anything divisive in politics, which deflects people's attention. And you could take the alternate view that individual action is the best way to affect change, especially in a political establishment that's been bought off. But the media really doesn't allow that to enter the public consciousness so much. Another unfortunate worldview, which almost everyone buys into thanks to the media and to surrounding society's conditioning, is the concept that the dollar or the euro is money, the defined value of money. You'll always see people say, even in the hard asset community, well, I'd like to buy this or that hard asset, but I have to pick the right time because hard assets are very volatile. You could more correctly consider that the dollar or the euro are very volatile in relationship to real money, something that retains value. But because people have been conditioned, even by their surrounding society, they think in terms of fiat currency as being the defined value of money, which is not volatile, when in reality, fiat currency is very volatile in relation to more stable forms of wealth. It takes a higher level of consciousness to avoid being drawn into other people's worldviews, and in my opinion, one of the ways to develop this higher level of consciousness is to be conscious of your evaluation of information, rather than passively receiving information. Jim Rogers is a great example of this. One time a reporter asked him, what would you do if you were head of the Federal Reserve? And you see a lot of Austrian economists get drawn into that worldview and say things like, well, the Federal Reserve should raise interest rates. Jim Rogers looked at the reporter like the guy was from Mars, and he said, what would I do if I were head of the Federal Reserve? Well, the first thing I would do is close the Federal Reserve, and the second thing I would do is resign. And these are just a few of countless examples of how public perception is formed on specific issues, and even how worldviews are formed by the establishment through the media, which they largely control. And again, I can't repeat it often enough, but the only way to overcome this is to stop receiving all of your information passively and to start critically seeking knowledge on various issues from many different sources and evaluating that knowledge with an open mind in order to find the truth. If you have a certain belief on something, purposefully seek out the opposing belief and evaluate it to determine whether your existing belief is correct or not. The majority of people get their information passively, and so naturally their worldview is going to be formed by other people who don't always, and in the case of the establishment, rarely have the interests of an individual at heart.